Thanks, Meredith, and wonderful opportunity to introduce Paul. Some of our people have asked me, so why is a philosopher contributing to this series? And my answer is that philosophers have a special contribution to make to our field. For my own sake, the best people for me at University of Michigan early on in evolution medicine were Peter Railton and Alan Gibbard, two well-known evolution and moral philosophers, not people in the biology department. And I think Paul Griffiths carries on that tradition, offering clear thinking that many of us find very difficult about these treacherous issues. I first got to know his work from his work on emotions and developmental theory. He actually was born in the UK and took his degree, first of all, at Cambridge and then at Australian National University. Currently, he's the director, domain leader for Society and Environment for the Charles Perkins Center. And that center actually, its goal is dedicated to easing the global burden of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and related conditions. I won't take much more of his time, except to also say that he's written what I consider to be the definitive current article on mismatch. I was thinking you might be talking about that today. But today his topic is, what is disease? And this is, we'll get to this in the question period, and I'll encourage you all right now to start putting things in the chat box, because there are a lot of controversial things. I mean, it matters what we say disease is, both for our own work and for all kinds of legal and social issues, and he's fearlessly dug into those. Paul, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Okay, I'm going to just do the share screen procedure, which will take a couple of seconds. Okay, that should be working. And okay, so I hope everybody can see the slides clearly.
Yeah, looks great.
Looks great. Okay, good. Great. Thanks for that introduction, Randy. So as Randy mentioned, I'm a professor of the philosophy of science. I'm interested in the biological sciences, the biomedical sciences, and I'm actually based with my students and postdocs in a large biomedical research center. In fact, the reason I'm able to do this talk is because I'm currently in Europe in a reasonable time zone, as opposed to the almost impossible time zone in Australia. And I'm here for a workshop of research groups of philosophers embedded in medical schools from around the world. We're running a summer school on how to make philosophy of science more useful to the sciences and medicine. The group I'm actually visiting here, Thomas Pradeaux's group, is based in the immunology department and works on issues around individuality and the development of individuality. So I'm sure most people here will have been exposed to debates around the definition of disease, the definition of disability, and the general...
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like your slides are not advancing for me.
I haven't advanced them yet.
Oh, okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Sorry, we philosophers, we talk a lot. We don't have so many pictures. I like to think of this as the general topic of distinguishing the normal from the pathological. And some of you may know that that was the title of perhaps the first sort of big, still influential discussion of this question in the 1940s by the philosopher and physician Georges Canguilhem, his book, The Normal and the Pathological. So some of you will also be familiar with the prevalence and perhaps dominance of value-based approaches to distinguishing what's normal from what's pathological. Approaches that emphasize that these are not objective scientific distinctions, but supposedly normative distinctions, reflecting the phenotypes that individuals and societies find desirable or undesirable. So just to give you an introduction, if you're not familiar to some of these ideas, here's an influential definition of health, quoting from the Routledge Companion of Bioethics. And to summarize, Kuckler's theory says that something is a health condition. So that's, again, carefully chosen language. We might have said is a disease or is a state of ill health, but she's using this language of health condition. Something is a health condition if it would be best for our collective well-being if it were medicalized. So roughly, we're defining here ill health in terms of what it would be most beneficial to society to assign responsibility for to our health institutions. So you can see there, basically health is defined as an absence of health conditions. In other words, to be healthy is not to have phenotypes which it would be beneficial to society if we were to assign responsibility for managing those phenotypes to the health system. Now that's if you hadn't come to this topic before, you would think that that was a pretty strange approach to defining health and disease, okay? It has a kind of obvious problem of its defining health and disease in terms of the health system. And you might very well ask the question, how do we know what's the health system if we don't already have an understanding of health and disease? How do we know that the hospitals are part of the health system, the prisons aren't part of the health system? And at the bottom there, I've got a very influential definition of disability from an acclaimed book called The Minority Body. And again, you'll see that this author Elizabeth Barnes, tries to define disability in terms of the judgments about what counts as disability made by the disability rights movement. So again, it's not, if you come to this topic for the first time, you might be puzzled to see somebody try to define disability by saying, well, let's start from the idea of there being a disability rights movement, and now let's make some kind of normative judgments about what it would be appropriate to seek equal treatment for, and then that'll give us a definition. So the trick here is to understand that what these kinds of authors are engaged in is something, again, not the most obvious thing to think about when you think about defining health and disease. What they're primarily concerned about is how we should organize the health system, how we should organize, in the most broadly understood aspects, those aspects of law and society which deal with health and disease. So there's a quote again from the Kukla paper there. The key issue here is the normative project of figuring out how a just state should manage health policy and health needs. So what I want to suggest is that rather than setting up definitions like this in opposition or conflict with scientific approaches to understanding the distinction between health and disease, or the distinction between the normal and the pathological, it's better to step back a bit and just regard this as a very different intellectual project. That, for example, for those of us interested in evolutionary medicine, it seems obvious that when we're thinking about the nature of health and disease, our ideas should not only be applicable to humans. It seems that we should be trying to understand something which is seen much more widely amongst species. Whereas to these authors, how these ideas apply to anything except possibly veterinary medicine is simply irrelevant. They're just not interested in what it might be a sensible thing to say about non-human species, or at least species that are not enmeshed with our society in the way that domestic animals or domesticated animals are. So I'm really going to put all those kind of ideas and try to put really to one side the idea that there's some kind of a conflict between value-based and sort of factually based approaches to distinguishing the normal from the pathological. And instead, I want to suggest that for people with interest in evolutionary medicine, we should really not be interested in defining what the word disease means, or understanding the appropriate applicability of words like disease, illness, disability, impairment, whatever it might be. We're all really coming at this fundamentally from a biological and a scientific perspective. And from a scientific perspective, the question surely is not what's the right definition of some word or other in some speech community, but what is the phenomena that we're engaging with in our science? So what is it that we're engaging with in nature, which we label with these various terms? So I have a nice quote there from the physician and philosopher Kurt Goldstein. How is it thinkable, he says, that disease and health should not be biological concepts? That starting out to ask ourselves, why does the world contain morbidity and mortality? The obvious place to look is to the biological sciences. We're trying to understand, why does the world contain disease and mortality? We don't think to ourselves, well, that's fundamentally a question about human values. Rather, we try to understand the nature of living systems. So that's Kurt Goldstein's idea, was that by understanding what an organism is, we would have some kind of fundamental insight into the distinction between the normal and the pathological. And I put that quote from J.B.S. Haldane's classic paper in the 1940s in, because of course, disease is really important in evolution, okay? It's not just that evolutionary theory can help us to understand disease. Disease can help us to understand the process of evolution. And so I hope that makes it clear why, if you are an evolutionary biologist like Haldane, it's clear to you that disease is important in evolution. You're engaged in an intellectual project which is almost incommensurable with the kind of social constructionist approaches or value-based approaches to disease that I was talking about earlier. Whatever the answer to the just way to organize a health system might be, it can't be talking about something which is an important agent in the history of life on Earth. Okay, all those kind of social and value-based issues are simply not there as causal agents for most of the history of life on Earth. So they're just talking about something very different. So rather than thinking about how to define the word disease, what we might want to do is look at our best scientific understanding of why the world contains morbidity and mortality, and see if there is a conception of what disease is, of what pathology is, morbidity, whatever, implicit in those explanations. Now, it seems to me that the most interesting question for somebody coming from an evolutionary medicine background is, given that we are sometimes producing convincing, successful, well-confirmed explanations of why disease phenotypes exist, what's implicit in those explanations in how we're understanding disease? Now, to my reading, if you look for accounts of what is the disease in the actual scientific literature in evolutionary medicine, you're not going to find very much. So Randy Ness has written a couple of papers explicitly about this, about the difficulty of coming up with definitions. And one thing that strikes you if you read through something like, say, the Gluckman et al. Principles, is that the science that's being conducted here doesn't seem to really require a definition of disease. There are a whole bunch of classes of phenomena that we can analyze and try to understand scientifically. And we don't need, when constructing those explanations, to really worry about whether the things that we're explaining are diseases or abnormal or pathological. So, for example, in evolutionary arms races, we're trying to understand why certain kinds of conflicting evolutionary interests between co-evolving species are so common and so stable. So what I've got here is the list of classic evolutionary pathways to disease. I've sort of synthesized this from several famous accounts. A challenge that I think somebody who doesn't believe that there is an evolutionary concept of disease, a challenge that such a person might make, is a challenge that was originally made by Canguilhem in The Normal and the Pathological. So here's a quote from Canguilhem. He says, "Strictly speaking, there is no biological science of the normal. There's a science of the biological situation conditions called normal. That science is physiology, and the converse for the sciences of pathology." Canguilhem's point was that once we've decided that we need to understand something, for example, susceptibility to cancer, we can wheel in a bunch of our sciences and explain why that phenomenon exists in nature. But the fact that we want to deal with that particular class of phenomena can be brought in from the practical, value-based concerns of providing medical treatment. So somebody who's skeptical about the existence of an evolutionary conception of disease might say there are many important natural phenomena which we come to understand in evolutionary medicine, but the fact that all of those phenomena are grouped together as pathways to disease simply reflects the fact that these phenomena are often relevant to understanding things that we want to intervene on in order to improve people's lives. So I'm trying to sort of explain how somebody who has a value-based conception of disease might not think that there is an evolutionary conception of disease without in any sense being hostile to the scientific activities that we're engaged in, recognizing that we're succeeding in explaining and illuminating lots of important phenomena that are relevant to disease, but thinking that the fact that all of these phenomena get grouped together as explanations of disease is something that we bring to the science and which motivates us to ask, why do these things exist and how can we intervene on them, rather than something that we discover by doing the science. Okay, so the claim would be that there are sort of a more reasonable kind of value-based approach to disease would be one which says we have a bunch of value-based questions that we bring to science, and science then answers them. Okay, and I say that's the perspective which Canguilhem himself had back in the 1940s. Okay. Now that's not a perspective I accept myself. I think we can develop something like a sort of deep evolutionary understanding of the nature of disease, but I think it's important to recognize that even if we can't give a sort of unified or coherent theoretical understanding of disease within evolutionary medicine, that's actually not very much of a challenge to the project of evolutionary medicine. We can understand a whole bunch of important biological phenomena which are important to the things that medicine's trying to do, even if the fact that those phenomena count as disease is something that is not a discovery of science, but a starting point or a presupposition of engaging in biomedical science. Okay, so I want to move on to the best known attempt to give an evolutionary definition of disease. Most people know of the medical sociologist Jerome Wakefield's work. This idea was also developed independently by the late Karen Neander, who was a philosopher of biology and medicine. It's a two-part definition of disease. It starts out with the idea of dysfunction and defines dysfunction in terms of evolutionary adaptation. So as you can see on the slide, the idea is that an organ is, or a part, you can extend this, any part or process within an organism is dysfunctional if it's unable to perform the functions for which it was shaped by natural selection. So if you're unable to store glycogen in some particular organ, and that's one of the functions for which that organ was shaped by natural selection, then it's dysfunctional because it can't do the thing for which it is an adaptation. And then the second clause says that diseases or pathologies are simply dysfunctions that we take to do harm. So it introduces a human value-based notion on top of an objective biological perception of dysfunction. Now, this approach has been widely criticized in philosophy of medicine, but I and my collaborator John Matheson have argued, I hope successfully, that most of the criticisms of this definition reflect basic misunderstandings of evolutionary biology. So a lot of people have, I mean, just to give you an example, one philosopher of medicine objected to this way of defining dysfunction by claiming that it would imply that whoever had the most children was healthiest. And obviously, that simply is no part of the idea that something's dysfunctional if it can't perform its adaptive functions. In no sense implies that rather silly view. So I think this is a perfectly coherent attempt to define something, but as John Matheson and I have also argued, it misses a bunch of very important phenomena which we want to draw attention to within evolutionary medicine. So the first of those phenomena is adaptations to adversity. So if we if we are looking at this idea that a disease is a failure to perform your adaptive function, then we'll have a problem with adaptations to adversity. So if we take that plant there, it's flowered early under drought stress. Early flowering in response to drought stress is an adaptation. Drought stress is part of the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness of the plant. That's why it evolved this response. A plant that flowers early in response to drought stress is not dysfunctional. In fact, it's performing the pathways that support this response are performing their adaptive function. Everything's working in exactly the way it's meant to work in the environment it's meant to work in. Nevertheless, things have not gone well for this organism. If you look at a similar phenomena in humans, for example, stunting and head sparing in malnourished fetuses, there's an important sense in which they are in a pathological state compared to a well-fed and normally proportioned fetus. Okay. So the selected effects definition misses the fact that there are adaptations to adversity, that some adaptive responses are second best responses or responses that you only undertake because life is not going well for you. So there's something in what I like to think of as biological normativity, the existence of differences between doing well and doing badly within biology that isn't being captured by the harmful dysfunction account. The second one I want to draw attention to, it's perhaps slightly subtler, but quite obvious really, is what happens when evolved adaptations are designed to make, speaking slightly metaphorically, to make decisions under uncertainty. So whenever you're dealing with adaptive phenotypic plasticity, you're typically dealing with decisions made under uncertainty. So the organism has certain cues it can respond to. Those cues don't perfectly predict the future. So the decision rule that you have to use to process the incoming information is a heuristic decision rule. It makes a bet, makes the best available bet, but it won't always be right. So classic example, it doesn't matter whether your views about the success of the hypothesis, it's just an example. But if you think about the classic hypothesis of Gluckman et al., that developing fetuses are trying to predict the future nutritional environment and respond by developing physiological settings that will maximize fitness in those environments, then it's obvious that even an adaptively optimal decision rule, the best possible design, is going to produce wrong responses, mismatched phenotypes, at a predictable rate. Basically, the fetus has to trade off type 1 and type 2 errors. There's no way of eliminating all of the type 1 errors without getting some type 2 errors or vice versa. So it's a very general adaptive problem. And what it means is that predictive adaptive responses, and indeed developmental plasticity, adaptive developmental plasticity more generally, will produce some mismatched phenotypes even when the mechanism is operating in its environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So the selected effects definition of dysfunction due to Wakefield and Neander that we talked about a few minutes ago seems to be missing another important biological phenomena, the fact that an evolved mechanism operating just as it is designed by evolution to operate and operating in its environment of evolutionary adaptiveness can still produce an error, can still produce something which in a biological sense is the wrong phenotype. Okay. So overall, John and I have argued in a paper a few years ago that there are 4 different ways in which things can go wrong for an organism. The first way that something can go wrong is that an evolved mechanism is broken. Something is intrinsically damaged. So up there, I've got a mouse with a broken leptin receptor. There's just a piece of mechanism which doesn't work because it's intrinsically damaged. Then there's mismatched environment. So I've got an obesogenic environment. Nothing wrong with the leptin receptor in those children, but their mechanisms of nutritional choice are operating in an environment to which they're severely mismatched. So those two ways of thinking fit under the selected effects account of health and disease of Wakefield and Neander. The two that don't are what we call hostile environments. So an organism which is in a pathological state because it's in a hostile environment, and even though it's producing its best adaptive response to that hostile environment, it's doing worse than an organism in a benign environment. It's adopting a strategy that is a response to things going badly. And the other one is heuristic failure. The fact that an optimal decision rule, nevertheless, has to accept a certain predictable rate of errors. And we need to be able to think about what has gone wrong when an organism is mismatched to its environment because a heuristic decision rule has generated an error. Okay. So in this 2017 paper, we argued that these first two ideas about health and disease are based on the difference between the adaptive design of an organism and its current operation. So there's a kind of historical dimension to them. And that the second two ways are based on comparing the current fitness of organisms to some reference class. So in the case of the hostile environment, we're comparing the current fitness of this organism to other organisms which got a nicer patch of the environment to live in. Okay, in fact, to their competitors, immediate competitors. And in the case of heuristic failure, we're comparing the individuals who, where the decision rule, where the Q correctly predicted the future, and where the Q, in the heuristic failure case, where the Q failed to correctly predict the future. Okay, so the organism made the right response to the Q, but the Q didn't correspond to reality. Okay. So in this case, we think we're looking at current fitness. In the first two cases, we seem to be looking at what was fitness maximizing in the history of a lineage. And so we argued that biological normativity, the idea that in a biological sense, things can go better or worse for an organism, that there can be normative judgments which are part of the biology of the organism, are really coming in two different kinds. One where we think about evolutionary design and ask whether something is operating in the way it was designed to operate, and the other where we look at the organism in comparison to some class of competitors and ask which one has succeeded in producing a fitness maximizing phenotype relative to those competitors. So one is about the past, one is really about some reference class in the existing generation of organisms. Okay, so suppose these are ideas that I'm hoping we will be able to develop in various ways I won't talk about into something more integrated. Nevertheless, what I would argue is that by thinking through the kinds of cases I've been talking about, we've gained a deeper understanding into that basic question: why does the world contain morbidity and excess mortality? So let's get back to where we started, and then I'll finish this idea of defining disease. What I've tried to argue in the last few slides is that we can, by looking at the whole range of biological cases and looking at our explanations of why we get sick, we can come to a better understanding of health and disease as natural phenomena. We can deepen our understanding of what it is in the world that we're interacting with when we try to understand health and disease. But that kind of deeper scientific understanding, I think it's important to recognize, won't simply translate into a objective scientific distinction between the normal and the pathological, or between disease and health, which simply identifies it with some class of natural phenomena. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first one is sort of more superficial, though not unimportant. The other one, I think, is deep and complicated, and where a lot of my current interests lie. So the first one is simply that the aims of healthcare are more complex than the maximization of biological fitness. So when we're engaged in scientific research, it may be that we can just think about what makes a biologically flourishing organism and try and understand that in the way that I've been doing in the last few slides. But terms like disease, disability, impairment are actually words and ideas that function within the social context of the health system, and the health system is trying to do a whole bunch of different things. It's not just out there trying to maximize the reproductive fitness of the individuals that it treats. Okay, so we shouldn't expect our sort of deeper scientific insight into the nature of health and disease to translate directly into definitions of terms that will correspond to how they are used or should be used in medical practice. Now, the second reason why I don't expect the sort of ideas that I was talking about in the last few slides to straightforwardly translate into an entirely adequate way of thinking about health and disease is, and there's a very provocative term, it's a certain kind of view about human uniqueness. And it's a view of human uniqueness that's been argued for by my former PhD supervisor in a number of very sort of high-profile books in evolutionary anthropology, the best known of which is The Evolved Apprentice in 2012. It's a view of human beings in which, in the same sense that hymenopteran insects are eusocial, that their biology is very different from many related species because of, oh, I've just written the wrong thing on my slide. It's not that humans are eusocial. That's a typo. Okay, social insects are eusocial. The word I meant to write there is a word I got from my biological collaborator, David Robenheimer. Humans are eucultural. So what's written on the slide in quotes, cross it out. It should have said eucultural. A eucultural species is one where central to their biology, central to how they've evolved and how they make their living in the world, is a rich body of evolved and transmitted culture, which is both an important part of how the species succeeded over evolutionary time, and also an important part of how individuals succeed in undergoing normal biological development. So it's frequently said that nothing could be more ridiculous than thinking that you could discover the true biological nature of an ant by bringing it up without a nest. It's an absurd idea. In the same way, the traditional idea of contrasting biology and culture and thinking that you could discover what human beings are really like biologically if only you could take culture away is absurd, because a cultural matrix is essential for normal biological development in humans, and the evolution of modern humans is critically the co-evolution of those modern humans and the cultures that they transmit. Okay, so it seems to me that in order to understand health and disease in humans, we'll have to solve one of the great challenges, in my view, in contemporary biology, which is really understanding how the biological and the cultural interact in human biology. Okay, and that there are a whole bunch of really difficult to think about issues there, which mean that what it is to be well functioning, what it is to be in a state of health in humans is more complicated than perhaps in many other species. Okay, so with that provocative and somewhat unsatisfactory thought, I will put my acknowledgements up and look forward to your thoughts and discussion on the ideas I presented. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation. Let me stop the screen share. Perfect. All right. So we have plenty of time for discussion, and we'd love to hear from you all. Do feel free to add questions or perspectives into the chat, or use the virtual raise hand function. We'd love to see and hear from you. And you can do that by clicking reactions at the bottom of your screen and then raise hand. Randy, can I toss it to you to start off our discussion?
Sure can. I hope a lot of other people will raise their hands or put things in the chat box, because there's so many things that are actually quite contentious here, Paul, from a social point of view, as well as from a biological point of view. I've recently been talking with or knowing about groups of people who are deaf, who say we don't have a disease, we don't have a disability, it's just a difference. it seems to me that the point of view you're taking might challenge them in ways that they would be upset about. And how do we resolve that kind of a controversy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, where I am roughly with that, Randy, it's a very, difficult and delicate kind of topic. First of all, I think we need to really get away in the philosophy of medicine from people setting up a attempt to understand health and disease as a scientific phenomena and the attempt to understand it as a socially and culturally situated phenomena, as if they were two competing theories, and see which one can score points off each other. Okay, and that's often how that debate, frankly, has been set up. I think we're moving away from that, but not fast enough. Okay, so I think the reason that I chose those two particular attempts to define disease and disability on my first slide was because when you look at them, it's so transparent that the people doing that work just have really no interest in understanding the biology of health and disease. They're only really interested in how should we organize certain aspects of the law and governance around the human health system. And it might almost be better. I mean, it might almost be better if somebody wants to get really concerned about the use of the word disability. Let's just find a different word for what we're trying to understand from a scientific point of view, right? So with respect to the case that you mentioned, here's the two things that for me are firm points that I've got a grip on. The first one is that in a non-human species, that would be a crazy view to take. Okay, if I was dealing with Eclectus parrots, my favorite species, the view that Eclectus parrots with hearing failure are a community doesn't make any sense. Eclectus parrots do form communities, they form small polyandric flocks, but they sure as hell don't do that around by identifying the physical impairments and building a community around them, right? So whatever's going on here is something you just do not see in non-human species. So I think one thing we can do is to try and understand what health and disease look like in the general case across all living forms, and try and keep away as much as possible from basing our account on what happens in the most complex case, namely the human case. Okay. The second thing I want to say is that when you think about what's happening in the contemporary disability rights movement, it's happening in a very specific context. It's happening in the context of an extremely rich and well-resourced society in which, with the application of a certain amount of social solidarity, actually differences in biological fitness can be absolutely minimized. Okay, and there's two ideas which I'm very chary of. One is saying that there's no relationship at all between the way I would think about disability in non-human species and the way I'd think about it in human species. And the other idea I would shy away from is that somehow we can strip away the cultural context in which we're actually having that discussion about disability now, and discuss whether or not something is disabled as would that count as disability in the state of nature? Okay, because that I think is invoking this idea that we can discover the true biological nature of something by stripping away culture. And I think that's really just a confused way of thinking about human beings. So no answer to your question, but some fairly strong views on how we shouldn't discuss it. And I think the area of the way forward on this is to try and understand what it is that constitutes a well-functioning human being changes over time as a result of the co-evolution of biology and culture, okay? And hope that understanding that will throw some light on what's the right thing to say about particular cases. So, I mean, the kinds of cases I'd be more inclined to try and really think through in detail are to do with So, for example, there are differences in what constitutes well-functioning of the respiratory system across different human populations because of different levels of local adaptation to life at high altitude. Okay, so I think you can actually look at how what constitutes well-functioning differs across human populations in a way that's influenced by the co-evolution of biology and culture, and hope to get a sort of deeper insight into how we might think biologically. I mean, and I do mean biologically, how might we think as biologists about what's going on in a complex, technologically based human society in which people are forming, you know, these bizarre, and from a historical point of view, which you can form communities in a way that's unrelated to immediate physical proximity, in which you can surround yourself with technologies that, you know, basically eliminate various kinds of what would otherwise be fitness differences. So I don't, you know, I guess one thing I don't want to do is to have an answer to thinking about a case like that that doesn't rest on really making some progress in thinking about how cultural change can be understood from a biological point of view as part of the biology of what I was calling a eucultural species. That's kind of where I am.
Good.
Not a very good answer, but I think it's better
I
than
think
any
we
other
see
answer
a
I
hand
got.
up from Adam, I think. Adam, would you put yourself there?
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Paul. Really interesting stuff. I had a background in philosophy, and when I teach an EvMed course to biomed students, I have one slide where I say, medicine actually can't define disease. You've been going your whole life without a good objective definition of disease. And you've just been using these words kind of as you do and as you're taught. You know, it's one of the first words that you learn when you're a little kid is that you're sick, but you never actually had an objective definition for it. And that's why I think the EvMed has so much potential. But that's more a comment than a question. So this is sort of related to what you've just been saying about the difference of culture now, but I'm wondering how we can get away from this extreme mismatch where, for instance, you know, people have extremely low fertility, although they seem to be in higher health than ever. If we eventually have to define, you know, function and dysfunction as something that does go via fitness, then it seems that we're going to be forced to kind of say that to some extent, you know, contraceptive pills and abortions are causing dysfunction in some technical sense, unless we, you know, have to frame function and dysfunction in terms of something historical, and we just say, okay, we'll forget modern culture is too weird, which is maybe what you've been pushing towards. Or maybe we bite the bullet and say, yes, it's a technical evolutionary dysfunction, but it's not harmful from a modern sense. But I'm just wondering where you would sit on this.
Well, two thoughts, Adam. The first one is we've just raised an incredibly complicated problem, which is what to say about function and dysfunction in this particular human community, which has been recently constituted in a very complicated and historically unusual way of running human societies, right? My answer is do what you do with any other scientific problem. Find a simpler case where the same issues play out and where you can really get a grip on it. Okay, so don't look at, you know, the ethical issues around the deaf community and the claims they want to assert on society, and various people want to push back against that. Find a much simpler case where cultural change seems to make some kind of an impact on what constitutes good functioning or bad functioning in a way that's relevant to human health, and study that until you have an actually coherent conceptual framework, and then take it back to the complex case. Okay, so I mean, I guess I should have said this perhaps in more simple terms to Randy. You know, my basic response to those kind of cases is don't look there. Look at something where we can actually get a more sort of rigorous database account of how cultural change over time has influenced what people regard as their lives going well or going badly. And so I'm particularly, as I say, interested in things like, you know, there are differences in the metabolic, there are differences in what constitutes a good or a bad diet based on microevolutionary changes between different human populations. There are differences in what constitutes respiration functioning normally or abnormally based on microevolutionary changes across human populations. And cases like that, I think we can actually get rich data on. We can work with scientists who are treating those as scientific problems, which is something I think we philosophers always need to do, to collaborate with people who are actually trying to get, you know, a detailed empirical grip on the case. And so if we do that, I think, you know, we've got much more chance of coming up with a well, rigorously kind of grounded conceptual framework for what to say in these complex cases. So running at them headlong at the complexity just seems to me to generate unnecessary fights where nobody actually has a very coherent framework from which to defend their position.
Okay, so I see two other hands up. Others who would like to ask a question, raising your hand is the best way, but we appreciate things in the chat as well. William Parker, please.
Thanks, Randy. Paul, that was a great lecture. Thank you. I've run into this problem a lot trying to define what a disease is, as I've worked with mental health issues, I think, as Randy knows a bit. So my question is twofold. One is, how much does this debate affect the field of medicine in general? So most of medicine, of course, just defines something as a disorder or a disease or an infectious disease or whatever, what have you. And there's really not much question. And of course, one of the big exceptions that I'm familiar with is, so the field of autism, mental health, depressive disorder thing, you know, the search in the debate with this, the search for a quote unquote cause of these things seem to be central in defining it. So again, two parts of the question. One is how much does this debate affect medicine, and then specifically narrowing in on somewhere that I know there's a profound effect with autism and maybe to a lesser extent depression. How do you see the debate going there? Thank you.
Right. Well, that's very dissatisfying aspect of my own work on this is that I always tell my students that they should try and work out what they would say about a physiological disease before trying to apply the same theory to a psychiatric disease, because basically when we have a rigorous mechanistic understanding of what's going on, it's a lot easier to handle the conceptual issues. When we're still kind of in the dark about the actual science, it's a lot, you know. So I think it's a big problem that, and philosophers like talking about controversial cases as well because they're controversial. But you know, what's that lawyers like to say? Hard cases make bad law, right? So you know, if we can't give a coherent answer for diabetes, we're not going to give a coherent answer for autism. So, but to come back to the practical value, I think where the kinds of ideas that I was outlining about what constitutes just an organism doing well in biological terms is that they're already more complex than I think, you know, a lot of I give some lectures to medical students about this stuff. And I think they're still brought up, for example, without, say, a life history perspective on health and disease, right? So the idea that they should look at an organism's current phenotype and norm it against a reference population without looking at, well, why is the organism like that? So, you know, what was their best response to the circumstances facing them at an earlier stage, right? So, I mean, I think a really nice example, perhaps that is relevant to your question, is if you're dealing with an organism which is producing an adaptive response to diversity, you don't want to try and return it to a norm based on the general population reference class, right? You've got to, you know, if you're intervening early, maybe you change the environment, right? But if you're intervening later, you should actually be asking yourself, well, what kind of environment has this organism been preparing for? And what kind of environment is it? So I think in a mental, again, I'm not going to speculate about particular cases in mental health, but obviously those kind of perspectives have relevance to understanding mental health. And I think, again, once we start looking at sort of, you know, biology, culture, co-evolution, we can sort of see that you really have to look at the organism in its context. So there's almost a kind of, you know, what some people in medicine call a kind of one health. You know, you've actually got to think about the whole environment in its state in order to think coherently about whether what this organism is doing is things going well or going badly for that organism. So I think, you know, the ideas like trade-offs, life history theory, and sort of developmental origins of disease and so forth, the idea of organisms as trying to get, you know, the sort of allostatic idea of organisms are trying to get ready to face the environment they predict. You know, all of these are very far away from the traditional idea there's a population norm that defines health and, you know, what we should be. So I quoted Kurt Goldstein, okay? And, you know, Goldstein's work was inspired by his work with incredibly damaged, both psychologically and physically, individuals after World War I, where he realized that as a doctor, the project of making these people normal with respect to a population norm was kind of absurd, okay? And so Goldstein thought, no, I've got to come up with a notion of what it is for this organism to be functioning well, and then I can have that as my target. And so he introduces the idea basically of marshalling the limited resources available to you to construct, you know, a meaningful way of being in your environment. Okay, I think there's a lot we could learn from literatures on how organisms physiologically adapt to early life damage, how, you know, organisms spontaneously reorganize into more functional states, again, that we could bring to bear in medicine, and that simply isn't there in a traditional medical perspective on what's normal and what's pathological. So yeah, no, I think deep biological theorizing about the nature of health and disease has quite a lot to teach us in medicine.
So we are running short on time, and there's several other questions in the chat. Maybe we could respond very briefly to a few things. Bob, is yours a brief one? Unmute, please. Unmute, please.
There's a lot of concern in medicine about identifying and treating risk factors. So conditions such as heart attacks or strokes are clearly pathological or dysfunctional, but how do we think about hypertension and the gradation in blood pressure between what's considered normal and what's extremely high risk?
Yeah,
so that's a challenge to answer quickly, Paul, but I'm going to ask you.
All I'm going to say is that
that's, it's
a really important issue in the literature on defining disease. The stuff that I've been worrying about hasn't related to that particular issue, Bob. I mean, so that's really not something that the material I've covered here has a lot of relevance to. I think it's going to show up even in the most straightforward cases where the straightforward adaptive understanding of the distinction between well-functioning and ill-functioning is there. Again, I think I know that you probably have come across the work that people like Steve Orszag have done trying to look at that kind of risk factor data in a more biological perspective in terms of changes over the life course, rather than just returning, you know, each age cohort to the population norm for its age cohort. So sorry, really important topic, not one I have useful things to say about.
Meredith, would you call on a couple of people who have put things in the chat, please?
Yeah, so we had a question in the chat a while back from Diana Sherry. This one's a little bit of a different question. So interested in your thoughts on this. Diana asks, what are your thoughts on the use of medicinal plants by chimpanzees?
Oh, interesting. So let me just say something, that would be a useful entree for saying something about this idea of human beings being eucultural. And I should just again say I pinched that from David Robenheimer, the nutritional ecologist. I often upset people by saying that I believe in that human biology is really qualitatively different from the biology of non-human species. And the kind of people I upset are people who have a very solid Darwinian instinct for saying correctly that anything you can identify about human evolution, you'll find precedents and precursors for it, because evolution is a gradual process. And when I think about animal culture, now I'm not sure whether those behaviors, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if those behaviors exhibit the kind of same sort of cultural transmission that we see in minimal tool use behaviors in chimpanzees, for example. Okay, that's why I don't say human beings are uniquely cultural. I say they're eucultural, in the same way that social insects and, you know, the mole rat and so forth, they're not uniquely social. Lots of organisms are social. It's just that their grade of sociality is central to everything about their biology and shows up in whatever you're studying about those kind of species. You can't study social insects and think, oh, they're just like cockroaches, but a little more social. No, there's been some kind of a transition, the literature on major transitions in evolution, some kind of a major transition in evolution when you move to eusociality. And in the same way, while I think there are animal cultures and animal traditions and all that stuff, they don't transform the whole biology of the species in a way that requires us to develop some new apparatus in evolutionary theory. And so in the same way that I think you can't just treat eusocial insects as slightly more social, something's happened, there's a transition in the level of individuality in that case. Euculturality, you can't just think of us as having more traditions than a chimpanzee population. Rather, the whole way that our species gets on in the world has come to depend on these massively complex cultural contexts, which we require to get anything like a normal human being out of the process of development, and whose collective possession of those resources by communities are how we achieve our biological fitness. So I think that's really, there are plenty of exciting people in evolutionary anthropology trying to make fundamental breakthroughs in understanding how biology and culture, how euculturality exists as a biological phenomena. That's anything to get away from biology versus culture, right? Trying to understand euculturality from an evolutionary and biological perspective. And I think when we crack some of those problems and make progress on them, we'll be a lot closer to having paradigms thinking about health and disease in humans that are fully adequate for humans, and pick up the cases that seem to just, where we just can't seem to get a grip on them, using what are very successful ways of thinking about health and disease in non-human animals.
So Meredith, I think our time is actually up. There are several other really good questions, none of which seem to have really very short answers. What's your judgment about whether we should take more questions or call it a wrap for today?
I think since we're at the top of the hour, let's take one more and maybe get some really quick thoughts. Given that we're at the top of the hour, I'll try to choose one last question that maybe might have a short response to it. So from the chat here, we have a question from Stephen Stearns, who asks, what happens if we discard the terms health and disease and talk instead about frequency distribution of things that can be measured operationally and how they shift with changes in the biological and cultural environment? Of course, recognizing that that moves us further away from the legal and administrative definitions, but might be one way to get more strict scientific clarity. If we get some brief thoughts on that, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply sympathetic to that impulse, Steve. The idea that we should try and understand what's going on biologically and then lay in the various social and value-related issues over the top. It's just that I myself think that, okay, I guess I think that if human beings had never evolved and nobody was thinking or writing about this, there would still be something essentially, I mean, organisms are goal-directed systems which are directed towards increasing the representation of their genes in future populations at distant time horizons. And that goal-directedness, that teleonomic nature of living systems, means that ideas of doing better or worse, things going well or badly for the organism, are really part of biology itself. So I'm very sympathetic to that as a strategy, but I think ultimately that biology itself does involve normative judgments. It's just the norms are biological norms. They're all fundamentally founded in fitness. And so that's what I was trying to push with the idea of, for example, heuristic failure. I think you can't get, if you build a model that involves heuristic decision rule, there's a normative idea in that model, but it's biological normativity. So sympathetic to the impulse, but I think normativity is part of biology because, I mean, I'll just throw the word teleonomy out there again, right?
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for that response. Since we're a little bit past the hour, I think we should probably wrap up. Thank you, Randy, for introducing Paul and helping moderate. And thank you so much, Paul, for sharing this discussion with us today. I think that the discussion could go on for a lot longer, which is what we really aim for with these events. This was our final Club EvMed event of the summer. We are taking a break until September, so make sure that you signed up for the Club EvMed email list at clubevmed.org to be notified when we have more sessions this fall. Otherwise, we hope to see you at iSynth in Lisbon here shortly, and have a great summer. And we'll see you back in September. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.